There are winds of change that not only blow through the rice fields, but also sweep away the fate of a dynasty. On the GOT Nuok Koyengawan channel, we invite you to join the dramatic story of the early Lei dynasty, when peace had just begun but had to face the underground streams of rebellion, mysterious shadows on the riverbank, and the secret appointment under the ancient banyan tree. This is a journey following a mandarin and the Returnee, a former rebel in the search for the so-called Returnee, the one who holds the red flag and the desire to change the dynasty. The story will take you through tense moments like a net spread on the river at night, harvests trembling in the political wind, and the ending that leaves an echo that history never really ends. If you want to know why a flag that has never flown makes the whole delta hold its breath in anticipation, let us open each page of this memory with the origin water drop that winter. The wind from the Red River blew back to Thanglong, seeping through every crack in the moss-covered roof of Kinthien Palace. The old citadel shivered in the mist, as if it was waiting for a change that no one could foresee. In the midst of that chaotic time, the name Lai Ngok Min began to resound more and more in the secret discussions between the mandarins. Ngok Min was the second son of the late emperor, not strong, nor famous for his military talent, like his elder brothers, but he had a refined writing style and a heart as soft as water. It was said that every time he read a sad poem, the young man could shed tears, then sit for hours at the desk, his fingers gently touching the edge of the paper as if to caress each word. At that time, I was just a young lady who had just been recruited to be part of the cabinet's edict copying team. The job was simple but gave me the opportunity to listen to the discussions of the nobles. It was thanks to those nighttime document copying sessions that I learned that Ngok Min would be appointed crown prince before many of the high-ranking officials. The news was like a gentle breeze passing over the surface of a lake, not causing big waves but leaving ripples in people's hearts. Ngok Min was very different from the princes often seen in the classics. While his brothers practiced archery and horse riding on the training ground, he hid in his study, next to books borrowed from the Imperial Academy. His left hand was grinding ink. His right hand was writing Chinese characters as soft as blue smoke. Once I peeked through the window frame of the dew paper and saw him tilt his head, eyes half closed, his hand resting on the page. He had just dipped in ink as if listening to a story from 1,000 years ago. On the day the news of the establishment of the crown prince was announced, there was no sound of drums or a grand banquet. There was just a series of decrees issued to each ministry and office, as quiet as the drizzle seeping into the walls. In the palace, some resigned from their positions. Others rushed to ask for positions for their children and grandchildren, as if they could smell the scent of change creeping into every cold stone corridor. I remember the night before Ngok Min officially donned the Eastern Palace robe. Thanglong was immersed in a cold, piercing rain. The lanterns in Kinthien Palace swayed in the wind, the pale yellow light illuminating the thin face of the man who would become king. He stood there, neither bowed nor raised, just looking through the dragon-embroidered curtain at the pitch-black darkness outside. At that moment, I suddenly understood that this was not the glorious beginning of a dynasty, but the quiet opening of an unpredictable period. Outside, the sound of frogs croaking in the Kimengu pond echoed. I pulled my cloak tight, feeling the cold seeping into my bones. The next morning, when the bell in the palace had just stopped ringing, Ngok Min stepped out, still thin and with slightly dark circles under his eyes. The robe he wore was not the heavy yellow brocade as usual, but a blue brocade embroidered with silver clouds in the ancient style of the Tran dynasty, simple but delicate down to every thread. I heard the tailors in the palace whisper, "He is very meticulous. Even if a hem is out of place, he will have to undo it and redo it." Not only the costumes, the palace also began to change. He kept the wooden houses from the Lataitu era, had poems carved on the pillars, and dug a pond to plant lotus flowers to evoke the tranquility of Taeho Mountain. One afternoon, I was allowed to follow the guard group through Minuet Palace, where the crown prince often read books after sunset. There was no sound of zither, no silhouette of beautiful women, only incense, the sound of pen touching paper and the figure leaning under the light shining through the small window. Ngok Min lived like a hermit in the palace, and we began to wonder, did he choose that way to avoid looking directly at the undercurrents rising from the north? News of the Ming army lurking outside the border had reached Thanglong, but in that study room there was only the rustling of paper and the smell of freshly ground ink. Looking at him at that moment, one felt as if one were witnessing a small oil lamp in the middle of a large room. The light was warm but fragile, and any wind could blow it out. But because of that fragility, that light made it impossible for one to look away. That coronation night, a thin drizzle fell like silk threads, covering the entire Thanglong citadel. The citadel was covered in a layer of cold dampness. The stone walls seemed to absorb every drop of water falling from the sky. Since afternoon, all the small alleys around the imperial citadel had soldiers standing guard, wearing raincoats to protect themselves from the rain, holding cold spears in their hands. There was no bustling music, no ostentatious procession, only soft footsteps on the Batrang-tiled yard leading to Kinthien Palace. I was then ordered to follow the cabinet to record the event. In the swaying lantern light, I saw Ngok Min step up the steps, each step slow, as if measuring the distance between himself and the throne. The light shone on his face, revealing his thin cheekbones, high forehead, and eyes that seemed to be looking at no one, only at the endless void behind the dragon-embroidered curtain. Inside, the ministers lined up on both sides, their robes and hats in full order. The voice of the mandarin reading the new king's name resounded, but it seemed to be drowned out by the rain outside. The congratulations became small in the quiet space. The throne was still majestic, but tonight it did not shine with gold, only reflecting the melancholy light of the oil lamp. When he put on his royal robe, we realized that it was not the heavy golden brocade that the previous kings had worn, but a dark green brocade, embroidered with silver clouds and knee-length cuffs, the style of clothing from the time of Lataitu. That choice made some civil officials nod in satisfaction, but the military officials remained silent. Perhaps they also understood that it was N'Jok Min's way of reminding the court that he wanted to maintain the old style rather than pursue new splendor. The ceremonial drums rang out 3 times, echoing against the damp walls and then dissipating like a sigh. I looked around, but no one was smiling. This coronation ceremony was more like a mandatory ritual than a festival. Outside, the wind blew through the tiled roof, bringing with it the sound of frogs from Kim Engu Pond, as if reminding me that spring had not yet fully arrived. When the ceremony ended, the new king left the palace, passing the row of bowing officials. He did not rush back to his own palace but went straight to the porch, standing watching the rain fall on the stone yard. The light from a nearby lamp shone on his slender figure, making one think briefly of ink paintings. Beautiful but quiet and somewhat fragile. That night, Thang Long slept in the sound of drizzling rain. But in my heart, a silent premonition was kindled. This dynasty would not begin with the sound of gongs and drums, but with a long silence like the rain on a January night. After the coronation, the court was busy with a series of ceremonies of receptions, awards, and rearrangement of titles. But the first thing the new king did was not to hold a banquet or go to the temple, but to call the masons from the statue department. I clearly remember that morning the mist was still covering the courtyard of Kinthine Palace. The cold wind made the flag on the Kai-Dai tremble. N'Jok Min, now Lahong Nam, the new reign name had just been announced, stepped out into the yard holding a drawing made of paper. He pointed to each step leading up to the palace and said in a low but clear voice, "From now on, all the steps in the palace must be lowered, no more than a handspan." The servants looked at each other in confusion, not understanding, while the workers muttered calculations. It turned out that because of his slender figure, every time he climbed the high stone steps, he felt tired. But that was not all. He wanted the mandarins, palace maids, and soldiers who went up and down the steps every day to suffer less from having to lift their feet too high. The order seemed small, but was enough to change the entire architectural appearance of the imperial city. After that order, many buildings were also renovated. N'Jok Min kept the wooden houses from the founding period, only painting and adding poems. In the inner palace, he built a lotus pond, opened a bamboo garden, and a small porch with yin-yang tiles, where he could sit and read books in the afternoon. Once, I followed the guards past the Min Yuyet porch, where the new king usually sat. The late afternoon light shone through the wooden doors, covering the tea table and the neatly arranged books. There was no sound of the pippa, no dancing beauties. There was only the sound of pen touching paper and the lingering incense. That king, dressed like a Confucian scholar, lived in the palace like a hermit, and wrote like a man unconcerned with power. I once heard a military officer mumble, "Your Majesty likes peace too much. What if there is trouble out there?" But to me, it seems like N'Jok Min is trying to build for himself a world that is just right, enough to breathe while the political storms out there continue to rise every day. Looking at him at that moment, I suddenly thought that perhaps those low steps were not only to ease the fatigue of his feet, but also a way for him to lower the distance between the throne and the people. But the throne was high, and holding it in his hands was never a matter of just a few steps. In the autumn of the 3rd year of Thunin, Thanglong capital experienced a cold wind earlier than usual. The leaves of the banyan trees around Tavong Lake had just begun to turn yellow when they were torn down by the wind. In that atmosphere, a heavy humidity seeped into every alley, even into the imperial city. People in the palace whispered to each other about a strange disease spreading in the workers' quarters outside the eastern citadel, starting with high fever and then red blisters all over the body. No one dared to call it by name, but everyone knew it was smallpox, a disaster that had brought death to many villages. The imperial city was isolated from the common people, with high walls and deep moats and densely guarded soldiers, but the disease never feared the vermilion gates. Just a palace maid or a servant brought offerings from the market without knowing that they were infected, and the invisible gate opened. N'Jok Min, now Emperor Lahong Nam, initially maintained his normal life. He read books, composed poems, and sometimes went to the garden to admire the late-season lotus flowers. I, who was still working in the cabinet at that time, was occasionally called to copy his new poems. Until one afternoon, while the court was discussing in Kanchan Palace, I heard that His Majesty was coughing continuously. The cough echoed from behind the yellow curtain, hoarse and persistent, as if each cough drained a bit of strength. The next day, the physician came in and reported His Majesty had a high fever and could not attend court. The entire court was silent. No one dared to speak, but worry filled their eyes. The fever lasted for nearly 3 weeks. When it subsided, faint scars appeared on the king's temples and collarbones like the dots of an unfinished painting. But the greater devastation no one saw. His health was rapidly deteriorating. His vitality was waning. His hand, which had once held the pen steadily, trembled slightly as he wrote, and his eyes were dark as if he had never slept well. After taking my pulse many times, the imperial physician softly said, "The vital energy cannot be released." Hearing that sentence, I shuddered. In the context of a dynasty in need of a successor, that diagnosis was like a knife cutting into the future. The harem of nearly 100 concubines, all of them virtuous and carefully selected, but year after year, there was still no sound of children. At night, in the quiet corridors, only the sound of wooden clogs gently tapping on the stone floor can be heard. There are nights when I pass by New Edmin Palace and see the light in the king's room still on. Inside, there is no sound of affectionate conversation, but only the rustling of paper and the sound of pens dipped in ink. A servant once whispered that when he is sad, His Majesty only calls a close guard to lie down with him, not for lovemaking, but just to feel his body in the cold night. The rumor spread from the harem to Dongjuan Market. The rumor was both pitiful and bitter. But for me, every time I saw the king in a pale tea-colored silk robe, skinny, walking through the lotus garden, I thought perhaps it was his loneliness that made him seek warmth in small things, rather than in power or beauty. After his illness, King Hongnam rarely appeared in public. He spent more time in his study, surrounded by the smell of ink and the sound of burning incense, as if he wanted to forget the wind of illness that had blown away part of his vitality. And it seemed that, from then on, the court also began to get used to the image of a king sitting behind a yellow curtain, his voice slightly hoarse, but his eyes still holding the sadness of an entire dynasty. In the Lei dynasty's harem, autumn that year came with dry winds and the sound of leaves falling softly on the brick floor. After his bout with smallpox, Emperor Hongnam rarely went out, and the vast harem, originally built to nurture the heir, was now like a silent garden without the sound of children. His concubines were all carefully selected daughters of noble families, well-versed in etiquette, with voices as soft as a stream, and gait as soft as willows. But year after year, people only heard the sound of clogs in the hallway, without the cries or laughter of children. The rare banquets in the palace only added to the emptiness, as flickering candlelight illuminated beautiful but sad faces. An elderly palace maid, who used to be the close attendant of the Empress Dowager, once whispered in my ear, "His Majesty is not close to anyone. At night, if he is not reading, he sits alone by the charcoal stove. When he is sad, he only calls a trusted guard to sleep with him, not for any reason, just to listen to each other's breathing." Those words sounded like a joke, but her eyes were filled with deep sadness as she spoke. Rumors leaked from the harem to the outside of the city, through tea houses and riverside vendors. Some people sympathized, saying that the king was too gentle and reserved. Others were sarcastic, saying that a dynasty could not last if the throne was cold. But no matter what the words, the truth remained that Emperor Hongren had gone through many autumns without a single child to call his father. I remember one late winter night, when the north wind was whistling through the roof of the palace. I was called to copy some verses he had just written. In the room there was only one oil lamp. The emperor sat at the desk, wearing a light tea-colored coat, his right hand holding a pen, his left hand pressing against a cup of hot tea. The words flowed from the pen, light as dew. But each sentence seemed to encapsulate his loneliness. One night I did not see the bright moon's shadow. The cold air in the front of the court penetrated the clothes. A night without seeing the moon. The cold air from the front yard seeped into my shirt. When I finished writing and looked up, he just nodded slightly, as if he didn't need anyone to understand the poem, just someone to write it down. That night, I returned through the long corridor, looking at the rooms with the lights off, feeling as if the vast harem was just an empty shell, gilded on the outside, cold on the inside. That cold, we know, comes not only from the northeast monsoon, but also from the loneliness of a king who cannot entrust his blood to the future. And when the harem is silent with children, the court outside also begins to feel more clearly the fragility of the throne. In the following years, Emperor Hongren seemed to withdraw even more. The court still held regular court sessions, but most of the time, he chose to stay in the inner palace, in a world that he had personally created. That space, compared to the vast palaces of the previous kings, was small and simple, but it was like a safe shell to protect the fragile soul of a monarch. He kept most of the wooden houses from the Latai II period, instead of building new ones with heavy bricks and stones. On the pillars and beams, he carved poems in Chinese and Nom characters. Poems not for show, but to record every little bit of his thoughts. In the middle of the yard, a round lotus pond was dug. The water was clear, the lotus bloomed in summer, The leaves withered in winter, giving him the feeling of being on the banks of the old West Lake. A corner of the palace was built with a separate study porch covered with yin-yang tiles, and the walls were painted a light tea color. In the morning, sunlight slanted through the window bars, shining on an ebony table with only a brush pen, an inkstone, and a few ancient books. In the afternoon, the wind carried the scent of incense from the temple next door, mixed with the rustling sound of bamboo leaves, making the whole garden seem separated from the outside world. The royal physician once whispered to me, "Your Majesty needs to rest more. Avoid the mental shock of politics." Perhaps that is why the court sessions are getting shorter and shorter, sometimes completely handed over to the regents. But I believe it is not just for health. Njok Min Hong Nam is deliberately building a wall of poems, books, and scenery to block the rising political waves out there. Once, I was allowed to follow the guard group past the Min Nuet Palace at dusk. Through the half-open door, I saw the king sitting alone, in a smoky silk robe, his hair tied neatly, his hands gently turning the pages of a book. There were no concubines attending him, no music or flutes, only the rustling of paper. The last light of the day fell over his shoulders, drawing a thin golden line, as if he wanted to keep that figure for himself. A military officer once lamented, "Your Majesty, if you stay in this place forever, who will care about the troubles out there?" But for me, perhaps this is how you survive, creating a world that is just right, with enough room for you to breathe, and enough quiet to forget the cracks spreading across the map of Dai Viet. Looking at him walking leisurely by the lotus pond, holding a paper fan, his figure as thin as a bamboo shadow, I suddenly understood, not everyone is born to hold a sword and ride a horse. There are kings who all their lives only wish to keep a corner of the sky peaceful, even though they know that the sky is just a small part in a big storm. News from the northern posts arrived on a misty morning. The envoy from Langjiang sent a secret message that the Ming army was increasing patrols along the border, building more barracks and food stores. The message was brief, but one could feel the tension hidden beneath each stroke. In the Privy Council, officials were divided into two factions, their arguments mixed with the sound of wooden fish striking the clock. The conservatives, mostly old-timers, argued that the situation was nothing new. The northerners have been like this since ancient times, making noise and threatening and then leaving it alone, said a white-bearded minister, his voice as calm as if discussing the harvest. The reformists, mostly young officials who had just passed the imperial examinations, insisted that their opponents had changed. They are no longer the same, clearing the way as they go, laughing as they measure the ground, said one, clutching his sleeve. Emperor Hong Ren from behind the golden curtain heard everything but did not interrupt. He only occasionally asked questions, his voice hoarse. If it is really a threat, what do they get? If it is not a threat, how long do we have? These questions hung in the air. No one could answer clearly. During those days, the imperial palace remained outwardly calm. In the Shangyuan garden, the yellow chrysanthemums were still blooming, and the scent of tea still wafted from the Taihei Palace. But we saw more guards changing shifts, war horses being led out to practice in the courtyard of the Wu Temple, and the armory being checked. Everything was done quietly, as if the court wanted to prepare without causing panic among the people. One early winter night, when the cold wind blew through the city, I was ordered to bring His Majesty's poetry collection to copy. In the study there was only one oil lamp. The emperor sat at the table, the light illuminating his much thinner face. He said, "There are waves coming from afar. I can hear their voices but not see their faces. When they come near, either I have prepared the boat, or I can only hug the board." Then he smiled faintly, continuing to write, as if turning his worries into words was the only way to endure. Out there, delegations of northern envoys still entered and exited the capital, bringing with them gentle words and luxurious gifts. But we know that, hidden behind the silk and the polite greetings, were eyes measuring every brick and every door of Fang Long Citadel. And in the small room where King Hong Nam sat, the distance between peace and chaos was as thin as a sheet of paper. On a March morning, the Ni River slowly flowed through the capital, a thin mist covering the water like a white veil. From Ninh Wharf, large and small boats were anchored close together, colorful flags fluttering, but the atmosphere was strangely heavy. On the east bank, the Northern Embassy's barracks had been set up many days in advance. Bamboo fences wrapped in red cloth, a tall flagpole, and a four-clawed golden dragon fluttering at the top. Emperor Hong Ren boarded the dragon boat that morning, wearing a dark blue robe with silver trim, not the bright yellow robe usually used in ceremonies. His hair was neatly tied up, with a green jade hairpin, his face calm but his eyes were slightly swollen, traces of many sleepless nights. Standing in the escorting guard, I saw his hands gently gripping the boat railing, the knuckles clearly visible under his thin white skin. The two sides had been exchanging letters for the past month, discussing stabilizing the border and maintaining friendship, but everyone understood that behind those beautiful words was a knife pressed against their necks. News from Langjiang and Tianquang reported that the northern military posts had advanced several miles into Dai Viet territory, erecting new landmarks, using the excuse of adjusting to suit the situation on the ground. The reformist faction in the court advised to cede part of the territory to preserve the whole situation, while the conservative faction strongly opposed it, arguing that losing even an inch of land would be a sin against one's ancestors. When the dragon boat docked, the northern envoy was already waiting. His robe embroidered with silver dragons, his high-top black hat, his polite smile but his narrow eyes shining with an inquisitive gaze. The greeting ceremony was quick. No drums, no music, only the sound of water lapping against the side of the boat. The throne and the negotiation table were placed right in the great tent on the shore, behind which were 2 rows of guards standing still as statues. On the first day, both sides only talked about formalities, recalled the old friendship, and exchanged gifts. The North offered silk and jade. Viet responded with Aga wood ivory and ink paintings painted by the emperor himself. But on the second day, the ambassadors' faces began to harden. They spread out a large map, with bold strokes pointing to the 3 border provinces, a dangerous piece of land, blocking the road from Nam Quan Pass deep into the interior. We could clearly see the tension on the faces of the Viet officials. A minister stood up, pointed at the map, and refuted each argument, but the northern envoy just smiled, poured tea slowly, and then said a sentence that made the atmosphere in the tent freeze. Either the 3 continents, or our war. That night, the emperor did not return to the palace. He stayed on the royal boat, the oil lamp shining through the window bars illuminating his thin figure sitting at the desk. I saw him open a book, but his eyes were wandering, not reading a word. Outside, the sound of the river water lapping steadily, the wind carrying the smell of damp mud and smoke from the fishing villages along the river. On the third day, the court was forced to make a decision. After much debate, the regents and ministers leaned toward the option of ceding land in exchange for peace. When this idea was brought up, the emperor remained silent for a long time. His eyes did not look at anyone, but only at a certain point beyond the curtain, as if looking through the fog to see the entire historical path stretching out before him. Finally, he nodded, very slightly, like a leaf falling into a lake without creating a ripple. The treaty was signed that afternoon. On the table, white paper and black ink, the writings of both sides intertwined, stamped with a red seal as bright as blood. When the emperor's pen touched the paper, I felt the whole space quiet down. Only the sound of my heart beating could be heard. After he signed, he put down the pen, his hand trembling slightly. As the delegation left, the wind on the Ni River suddenly changed direction, colder than in the morning. The flags on the dragon boats fluttered, but no one saw joy in anyone's eyes. Because everyone understood that the peace today bought with land was not a lasting peace. Returning to the palace, the emperor did not immediately go to court. He went straight into the lotus garden, sat down next to a dry lotus, and touched the petals that had almost all fallen off. I stood far away, only to see his shoulders shaking slightly, not sure if it was because of the cold wind or because of something heavy in his heart. Afterwards, he summoned the cabinet, ordered the entire negotiation process to be recorded clearly, and instructed that it must be kept in the national history so that future generations will understand the value of the word peace in the following days. The capital was still as noisy as before. The market was still open. The cries of wares still echoed throughout the alleys, but in the tea houses where the elders gathered, the story of the 3 lost provinces became a topic of both whispers and sighs. Some people blamed the king for being weak, others pitied the king for struggling alone. As for me, every time I recall the image of the emperor on the banks of the Ni River, his dark blue robe amidst the white mist, I know that was the moment he bore a scar that would follow him for the rest of his life. After the treaty on the banks of the Ni River, the Thang Long citadel appeared peaceful on the outside as if it had never experienced a bitter bargain. In the morning, the bell of Tranvu Pagoda still rang in the distance. Dongjuan Market was still bustling with buyers and sellers, vegetable and fish vendors jostling each other on the brick-paved road. But inside the imperial palace, a strange silence was spreading. The discussions of state affairs became cautious. Each official weighed each word when speaking, afraid of accidentally touching a wound that had just healed. After the treaty, Emperor Hongren attended court less often, but appeared more often in the study. He began a new habit. Every afternoon, when the sun was leaning towards the west, he would call a few young officials to the Mingyu Palace, not to discuss state affairs, but to read the classics. At first, the cabinet thought this was just a way to kill time, but gradually we realized it was a small class that the emperor himself presided over. He chose passages from the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, and the Analects, interspersed with Nam poems by predecessors such as Nguyen Trai and Nguyen Bin Kim. His voice was deep, neither high nor low, each word falling like a drop of water on the surface of a lake, rippling but not breaking. Every time he finished reading a passage, he would put the book down and ask the young mandarins, "How do you understand taking the people as the foundation?" Or, "Why must a king know how to retreat as well as advance?" These questions, we know, were not only to test their intelligence, but also to enlighten ourselves. One afternoon, when it was drizzling, a few early peach blossoms fell on the wet steps. I was called in to copy the lecture. He read a passage from Mencius, The benefit of a country is its people, its roots are firm, and its peace is assured. He paused, looked out at the rainy courtyard and then said softly, to protect the land is also to protect the people. But, when forced to choose, I chose the people. His voice was quiet, as if he was afraid of wetting the words with his breath. These readings took place, even though the situation outside was far from peaceful. News from the Sun Nam region reported that the rebels in the riverside districts had risen up to protest the land concession. Some militia leaders called for the restoration of the ancestral estate with swords and spears. At court, the anti-treaty faction secretly sought to connect with them, but the emperor continued his life as if nothing had changed. Brief morning court sessions, afternoon reading, evening writing poetry. A high-ranking official once boldly advised, "Your Majesty, in times of chaos, reading books is not enough. We must train soldiers and prepare weapons." After listening, the emperor only smiled lightly. Books are to teach us how to use soldiers properly. Weapons, if not used wisely, will turn around and kill their masters. That answer silenced the entire palace. I remember one time, when there were only 2 of us in the study, the emperor asked me, "Do you think it is possible to use the words of the sages to stop swords and spears?" I did not dare to answer, only bowed my head. He smiled slightly, a smile that was both sad and helpless, then picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, and continued writing the unfinished verses. Outside, the rain continued into April. Reports from the border said that some northern soldiers were still sneaking across the border, using the excuse of visiting relatives or doing business. Guard posts had to increase their troops, but the order from the royal palace was no provocation, only surveillance. In this context, the reading sessions in the palace were like an oasis, where people temporarily forgot the sound of horses' hooves and the smell of gunpowder. Gradually, the emperor's special class attracted not only young officials but also some old officials. They came, sat at the desk, listened to him read, and discussed together. One day, from a sentence in the Analects about humanity and righteousness, the conversation drifted to protecting the country. From protecting the country, the discussion turned to protecting the people's hearts. Each session lasted until the oil lamp was half empty, and the moon was high in the yard. But we know that no matter how profound the teachings are, outside that door, the times are still like a cart rolling downhill. People still sit and listen, but their eyes sometimes have a hint of worry, as if they are afraid that one day, the sound of reading will be drowned out by the sound of war. The emperor, perhaps, knew this too, so every lecture he ended with a reminder: a mandarin must know when to draw his sword and when to close his book, but never let the book collect dust. After listening, everyone fell silent, bowed their heads and then left, leaving only the sound of paper turning and the lingering scent of incense in the room. To me, those rainy afternoons in Minuet Palace were like an oil lamp placed in the wind. That light could not dispel the darkness of troubled times, but at least showed me that there was still someone trying to hold on to wisdom and morality, even when everything around them was falling apart. After the reading sessions at Minuet Palace, the court still functioned, but not as before. People began to call Emperor Hongnam's way of working the paper court. That phrase came from the fact that almost all edicts, all discussions, all big and small decisions were made on paper. In the past, the courtiers gathered at Kanchan Palace to directly report, discuss, and refute. Their voices echoed throughout the palace, sometimes harshly, sometimes loudly. But at least everyone could see each other, feel the enthusiasm or reserve of the other side. Nowadays, the emperor rarely appeared outside the yellow curtain. The court sessions were reduced to only a few times a month. Most of the work was resolved through memorials written on due paper, presented, waiting for the king's approval, and then passed down. I, as a secretary in the cabinet, became an involuntary intermediary. Every morning I held a stack of memorials from the ministries of personnel, finance, military, justice, rights, and public works. Each one was neatly written and stamped with a red seal. I entered the study, placed them all on the table next to the emperor's desk, and then quietly withdrew, waiting for him to read them. Usually in the afternoon I would return to receive them at this time. On the corner of each memorial were thin, slanted lines of his pen, accompanied by the jade seal. Many times he would only write a few words, as reported, relentless, or reconsider. But there were also days when he would carefully write down long paragraphs, explaining the reasons, citing scriptures to prove it, and even quoting ancient poems. I remember a report about raising taxes in the Red River Delta to cover military supplies. Instead of agreeing, the emperor wrote, "Raising taxes during a bad harvest is like taking a coat from a cold person." That sentence was enough to make the entire Ministry of Finance meet to find another solution. This method slowed down the work, but also avoided direct arguments that could easily turn into factional conflicts. For the emperor, it was probably a way to keep the balance between the undercurrents in the court. However, because they did not meet each other often, the high-ranking officials gradually lost the opportunity to discuss directly. Trust between them faded, and each person withdrew into his own group. Once, I asked the minister, "Why didn't you ask to meet His Majesty in person?" He just smiled sadly. It's fine, but what's the point of meeting him when your thoughts are all on paper? That answer made me realize that the court was gradually turning into a giant correspondence, where people spoke to each other with ink, not with their eyes. Outside the palace, people still spread rumors that the king was busy studying books and writing scriptures. Some praised him as a wise king who loved literature. Others criticized him for being out of touch with reality, leaving politics like a piece of paper to the wind. But I, who saw with my own eyes every stroke of his handwriting on his memorials, knew that this was not indifference, but an unusual effort. He wanted to keep his distance so as not to be caught up in the anger and intrigues of factions. However, the court on paper also had its price. Military decisions often came late, because news from the frontier had to pass through many post stations before reaching the capital, and then had to wait for the emperor's approval. There were uprisings by militiamen that should have required a response within a few days, but it took the court a month to dispatch troops. By then, either the rebellion had dissipated on its own or it had become a new explosive. Late at night, when I stayed behind to copy the decrees, I often saw the light in the emperor's study still on. He sat alone, a brush in his hand, writing slowly but surely. Occasionally, he would look up at the bamboo garden where the moonlight was silvered on the leaves. Once, I heard him mumble, "Paper is thin, but it can block a knife if the person holding it knows how to use it." I did not know who he was talking to, or if he was just talking to himself. And so, day after day, the Dai Viet court still operates on pages of paper. Each memorial, each comment becomes an invisible thread connecting the mandarins together, connecting all of them to a king who rarely shows his face. But deep in our hearts there is still a lingering worry. Paper can hold words but cannot hold the warmth of people. And when that warmth is lost, the court will become a giant archive, beautiful, orderly, but cold to the bone. While the court outside operated on paper, inside the harem whispers were also increasing. The Dynasty's harem was originally a closed world, reserved only for concubines, palace maids and a few eunuchs. But even within those towering walls, news and rumors still crept in like the night wind. No one knew where it started and how far it would blow. After his bout with smallpox, Emperor Hongren almost never visited the concubines' palaces again. At night, the lights in the study were still on, but the lights in the empresses' and concubines' palaces were turned off early. Many nights, the palace maids on duty in the hallway could only hear the footsteps of eunuchs passing by, without the laughter or sounds of lutes and flutes as in the early years of the dynasty. His absence left a void, and the void was filled with rumors. It was said that the king had lost interest in the succession of his lineage, that he found joy in books and poetry. More viciously, some said that illness had left him without any manly strength. Whether true or not, these stories spread from the harem to the corridors of the palace maids, beyond the Ngo Mon gate, and out into the streets. One early summer afternoon, I was called into the Dirindo Palace to copy some genealogies that the queen wanted to preserve. While I was bowing my head to write, I accidentally heard two young palace maids whispering behind the curtain. I heard that the queen offered tea 3 times and invited His Majesty to stay, but he only sat reading a book and then stood up to leave. That's why it said, "Flowers blooming in the palace are useless." They both laughed softly, but the laughter was more bitter than playful. The harem was not lacking in young and beautiful concubines of noble birth, carefully selected from all over the towns. Each came here with the dream of becoming the mother of the world, or at least the mother of a prince. But as the years passed, that dream faded away, replaced by long days of waiting and silent jealousy. One night a trusted eunuch whispered to me. A palace maid secretly sent a letter to her family asking to leave the palace with the reason of unhealthy. In fact, it was because she did not want to waste her youth in a place where no one cared. After hearing that, I just kept quiet, because I knew that even if she left the palace, the scars of the years of neglect would still remain in that girl's heart. As time went on, the stories in the harem became more and more political. Some high-ranking officials outside the court began to seek to bring their nieces, sisters or daughters into the palace, hoping to create a blood relationship to strengthen their positions. But all these plans were met with the emperor's wall of silence. He still received the new concubines according to the ceremony, gave them generous rewards, but then never returned. The queen, considered virtuous and discreet, was not immune to the whispers. Some said she was trying to persuade the king to adopt a confidant son as his heir. Others said she secretly hoped the throne would revert to her family, but no one ever heard her say anything, and her silence only added to the confusion. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves of the parasol trees had fallen all over the yard, I happened to meet the emperor in the royal garden. He stood by the withered lotus pond, holding a dry lotus flower in his hand. I bowed my head in greeting, and he just nodded slightly and said, "Do you know why people like to talk behind people's backs?" Before I could answer, he continued, "Because that's the only place where they feel they have the right to tell the truth." Then he dropped the lotus flower into the water, walked slowly, his back long and thin amidst the yellow of the fallen leaves. At that moment I understood. The emperor knew all the whispers in the harem, knew and accepted them as part of the court. Because the court and the harem, after all, were worlds where power and desire collided. and rumors were just the echoes of those collisions. But we also know that the more whispers there are, the wider the gap between the emperor and those who live under the same roof. And when that gap becomes too great to bridge, a kingdom is no longer a shared home, but only a series of separate rooms, closed, cold, and full of darkness. That night, Thang Long was covered in a thick layer of fog, as if the entire capital was holding its breath. In the palace, the long corridors were quiet. Only the sound of the wind whistling softly through the tiled roof could be heard. I was ordered to stay at the cabinet later than usual, because there was an urgent matter from His Majesty. At the hour of Tai, a trusted eunuch suddenly appeared, his face solemn, holding an envelope sealed with red wax, on which was imprinted a small jade seal, the kind used only for top-secret orders. We call it secret night edicts. Edicts that do not go through a court session, are not recorded in national history, and are only passed on to the right person for the right job. The eunuch handed me the envelope and instructed, tomorrow morning, you must personally deliver it to the Minister of War. Do not let anyone else touch it. I nodded, but my heart was filled with curiosity and anxiety. Back in my office, I sat by the oil lamp looking at the dark red seal with a heavy heart. According to the rules, I was not allowed to open it. But sometimes the handwriting on the outside revealed something of the great matter inside. The small, cursive, slightly tilted handwriting indicated that this was an edict on precautions in the north. My mind immediately flashed with recent news reports, news of increased patrols by northern troops near the border, news of strange merchants carrying more maps than goods. The next morning, I brought the letter to the Minister of War's office. He was a silver-haired old general who had fought in the LA Thantong era. He was now nearly 70 years old, but his eyes were still bright. After receiving the letter, he did not open it immediately, but instead led me into the back room and closed the door tightly. When the red wax was cut, the smell of incense smoke from the family altar mixed with the air. I only managed to catch a few lines before he covered them up, in order to secretly mobilize a number of elite military units from Sante and Kin back to guard the passes, and to rearrange the food warehouses in the border area. What was noteworthy was that everything had to be done quietly, without causing disturbance to the people and suspicion in the north. If the order were made public, it would be a tacit declaration of war. But in the darkness, it was just silent footsteps on the road to prepare for the worst. The minister looked at me, his voice hoarse but clear. His Majesty does not want war, but he cannot sleep peacefully. This matter you have not heard, have not seen. I understood. This was more of a warning than an order. In the following days, we began to notice strange signs. In the courtyard of the martial temple, troops practiced at dusk instead of during the day. In the Ministry of Public Works warehouse, the number of arrows and spears was carefully checked, but the records were kept the same, so that outsiders would think nothing had changed. Even the transportation of food was disguised as support for the famine areas. However, I still feel uneasy. Preparing in silence is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it avoids the risk of being provoked by the enemy. On the other hand, it easily makes the people in the country lose their guard, so that when an incident occurs, they will not have time to react. But Emperor Hongren seems to have chosen this path as a dangerous move, only revealing it when necessary. And when revealing it, it is too late for the enemy to turn around. Another night, I was called to his study. The lights were low, and the shadows of the bamboo trees on the walls were like faint spears. He handed me a small notebook, covered in green cloth, filled with dense notes on the situation on the frontier, not just military news, but notes on the temperaments of each garrison general, their habits, their relations with the local chieftains. This, he said, is the real court. Not on paper, not in verse. Keep it, and you will know who to give it to when you need it. I received the book, feeling as if I had just held a piece of the key to the nation's destiny. Leaving the study, the night wind was cold, but my heart was burning. I knew that the secret edicts of the night would not stop here. And each of those edicts, whether short or long, were paving stones on the path that Dai Viet had to take in the coming days, perhaps in peace or perhaps in fire and smoke. Early morning in the northern border region, the fog was as thick as a white silk veil wrapped around the mountains. From afar, the silhouettes of guard posts and watchtowers appeared faintly like ink dots on a watercolor painting. The wind from the north carried a chill, penetrating through every gap in the soldiers' clothes, forcing them to pull up their cloak collars. I was sent to join a secret food inspection team, a mission not recorded in public records. The team consisted of a Ministry of War officer, several captains, and a few people like me, pretending to be secretaries. From the capital to here, it took nearly 10 days by horse, through many villages, valleys, and winding mountain passes. The closer we got to the border, the more clearly we could see the tension permeating the land and sky. At Bakjong town, we met the general, a man of average height, with tanned skin and deep black eyes that seemed accustomed to seeing far through the fog. He received the delegation in a large stilt house, with clusters of golden corn hanging outside, and the smell of smoke from the kitchen mixed with the smell of dried animal skins inside. After a few greetings, he took us to see the barracks. Under the mist, troops practiced archery, the sound of bowstrings like a steady heartbeat. In another corner, Soldiers practiced swordplay, each leaving a faint trail in the mist. I realized they were not wearing the shiny armor of the capital, but light leather jackets that were easy to move in the mountains. Here, speed and neatness are more important than beauty, the general explained with a chuckle. The granary was located in a deep cave, the door camouflaged by thick bushes. Inside, dozens of jars of rice, salt, and dried meat were neatly arranged. On the cliff, we saw strange symbols engraved. The Ministry of War officer whispered, "The secret storage code. Only the garrison and the Emperor know it all." When the group returned to the citadel, it was late afternoon. The mist gradually cleared, revealing the mountains on the other side of the border. Standing on a high watchtower, I looked through the observation slot and clearly saw a few figures on horseback wearing thick coats, slowly patrolling. They did not cross over, but the distance was so close that I felt as if just one loud shout would cause both sides to charge at each other. That evening, the general invited us to a simple meal: grilled venison, wild vegetables, and warm corn wine. When the wine had taken effect, he lowered his voice. "The Northerners have sent many envoys to the town in recent months talking only about trade, but their eyes are not on the goods but on the roads and the landing places. I do not believe in their gentleness." He paused for a moment, his eyes looking out the window, where the new moon hung over the mountains. "If war breaks out, we will be the first to take the hit." But he smiled faintly. "The gatekeepers must get used to it, like getting used to the cold and the dew." At night, I went out to the barracks yard. The fog fell again, this time thicker. The moonlight was only a halo of light. The footsteps of the patrol echoed. The barking of dogs echoed from the distant village. I suddenly understood that the border and the fog was not just a scene, it was the state of an entire land. The landscape and the people lived in the blur between peace and war, between stability and uncertainty. The next morning, before the group left, the garrison general handed the officer of the Ministry of War a small bamboo tube containing a folded piece of paper. No one read the contents, but we know that it will follow the postal route straight to the Emperor, like a thin thread connecting the capital to the border. And on that thread, every vibration, no matter how small, can become a signal for a great wave. News of the Sun Nam rebellion reached the capital on an October morning, when dew was still on the roof tiles of Kanchan Palace. The first report simply stated, the militia gathered, burned down the tax station, and shouted against the court. But as subsequent reports came in, the picture became clearer. This was not just a sporadic disturbance, but a fire spreading rapidly on dry ground. Sun Nam is a fertile plain with a network of rivers and lush green rice fields. However, in recent years, floods and pests have caused crop failures. The people have not only had bad harvests, but also had to pay taxes. And rumors of land concessions at the border have made people uneasy. A group of local tyrants took the opportunity to call for protecting the land and protecting the people, gathering young men and calling themselves the Hongjiang Rebellion. In the early days, the rebels only destroyed tax stations and distributed rice to the poor. But then things got out of control. They occupied some granaries, burned the royal flag, and hung their own flag. This news shocked the capital. The courtiers were divided into two factions. The hardline faction demanded immediate military suppression. The moderate faction advised negotiations to avoid bloodshed. Emperor Hongren, as usual, received all opinions in writing. But this time, he summoned both factions to the Mingyu Hall. Sitting on a simple dragon chair wearing a dark blue robe, he listened to each one. When the hardliners ended their speech with, "Rebels cannot be forgiven," the emperor simply closed his eyes. When the moderates said, "Your Majesty, they are also your people," he remained silent. Finally, he ordered on the one hand to send a delegation including the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Justice to Sun Nam to negotiate. On the other hand, to prepare a reserve army nearby in case the fire goes beyond the country's reach. The order was written that very night, stamped with vermilion, and sent by the fastest postal horse. We were assigned to the group recording the delegation's journey from the capital to Sun Nam. The road followed the Red River, which was red with alluvium this season. Along the way, many villagers were quiet, their bamboo gates tightly closed, with only a few curious eyes peering out from the cracks of the doors. The atmosphere was tense like before a storm. When approaching the area controlled by the rebels, the delegation had to stop at the ferry. On the other side of the river, men in brown shirts, holding spears, stood in a row. In the middle of them, a large man with a tanned face and a red scarf tied around his neck. The leader of the Hongjiang Rebellion. He did not step forward, but only ordered someone to row a small boat to pick up the negotiating representatives. The meeting took place in an abandoned communal house. Inside, on an old rosewood table, there was no tea or gifts, just a map of the Sun Nam region. The leader of the insurgents pointed to it and said firmly, "We are not against the king, but we are against corrupt officials. If we want peace, the court must reduce taxes, abolish corvée, and promise not to sell land." The Minister of Finance replied in a calm tone, "Selling land is not His Majesty's intention. Reducing taxes and abolishing tolls is a major matter that must be discussed at court." But those words were like the wind blowing through the rice fields. They did not touch the roots of anger. The negotiations dragged on until the afternoon without any results. Meanwhile, the reserve army was ordered to move closer, setting up camp just a day's journey from Sun Nam. No one knew when the order to attack would be given, but everyone knew that if it happened, blood would flow down the rivers that were used to carrying only silt. On the last night in Sun Nam, I sat on the porch of the inn, listening to the sound of drums echoing from the distant village, mixed with the barking of dogs. In the darkness, the insurgents' fire was still burning on the other side. Not the fire that burned down the house, but the fire of the piles of firewood that kept us warm. But its red light still made me shiver, because I know, the fire in the heart, once ignited, is hard to extinguish with just a promise or a red pen. The next morning, the delegation returned to the capital. On the way, a strong wind blew in from the sea, carrying with it a hazy smell of smoke. I did not know if it was smoke from the village kitchens or from the war that had just begun, but in my heart, an ominous premonition persisted. The fire in Sun Nam would not stop in Sun Nam. That day in Thang Long, it rained from the 5th watch until noon. The small, dense raindrops fell like a thick mist, covering the entire imperial city in a cold, damp gray. The brick pavement in front of Kanchan Palace was glistening with water, and the sound of the guards' boots hitting the pavement created a steady, cold sound. But inside the palace, the atmosphere was as tense as a storm cloud that refused to break. Emperor Hongren convened a conference, actually a special court session, to discuss countermeasures for the Sun Nam incident. Unusually, he personally sat on the dragon throne in Kanchan Palace, removing the yellow curtain that normally covered his eyes. Civil and military officials, each with their own appearance, lined up according to their rank. The sound of rain hitting the tiled roof mingled with the deep voices of those debating. The hardliners opened with a long petition, accusing the Hongjiang insurgents of using the name of protecting the people, but in reality opposing the court. They proposed to immediately dispatch troops from Kinback and Thanho, launch a simultaneous attack, and cut off the snake's head to warn the people. Their tone was as hard as steel, and their eyes glanced defiantly at the moderates. The moderates immediately objected. They argued that hasty repression would only push the people into the hands of the rebels, turning a troubled region into a region of fire south of the Red River. A high-ranking official quoted Mentius, "Only by winning the hearts of the people can one keep the world to emphasize the need to negotiate, reduce taxes, and even grant amnesty to the rebels if they agreed to disband." The argument lasted for 2 hours. The voices varied in pitch, sometimes like autumn wind, sometimes like early summer thunder. The emperor remained silent, holding a paper fan in his hand, only occasionally tapping the edge of the throne. His gaze swept over each person, as if weighing their words and the sincerity behind them. Suddenly, a flash of lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating the raindrops sliding down the curved roof of Kanchan Palace. The emperor put down his fan and slowly said, "You all are right, but no one has said it all." The fire in Sun Nam was caused by winds blowing from many directions. Winds of corruption, wind of crop failure, wind of rumors. To put out a fire, you cannot just put out the flames. He turned to the Minister of Finance. "You immediately draft an edict to reduce taxes for the flood areas for 3 consecutive years. Then he looked at the Minister of War. "You keep the reserve troops nearby. Do not advance further, but do not withdraw. If the insurgents cross the predetermined boundary, immediately fight back." Finally, he ordered the Ministry of Justice to send more people to investigate the local officials. Whoever embezzles from the people will be tried before judging the merits and crimes of the insurgents. That order silenced the entire hall. A few of the previously tough faces changed their expressions, understanding that this blow would not only hit the rebels, but could also hit their own side. When the officials left, the rain was still falling. I stayed to write down the previous edicts, and saw the emperor step down from his throne and walk towards the window. He stood there for a long time, his eyes looking out at the wet courtyard. Suddenly he said softly, as if talking to himself, "Rain is good for the fields, but if it keeps falling, the water will wash away the rice. The same is true for governing the people." I did not dare to answer, only silently bowed my head. In the sound of the drizzling rain, I suddenly saw more clearly the difficulty of the throne. It was not only heavy with power, but also heavy with each small drop of rain that was gathering into a stream, forcing the person sitting there to find a way out of the flood for the whole world. Late that afternoon, as the last rays of the day were sinking on the other side of the Red River, unexpected news arrived at the imperial city. An envoy from Sun Nam had just returned. This person was not a court official, nor was he part of the official delegation, but was a former civilian in Sun Nam, who had wandered for many years. I was ordered to go to NGO Mon Gate to welcome him. In the pale yellow light of the afternoon, I saw him, thin, with an old raincoat over his shoulders, a tanned face, deep eyes that seemed to contain many things he wanted to say but did not dare to say. Although he was dressed like an ordinary person, his steps were slow and steady, like someone who had traveled through many lands and knew how to survive in turmoil. He was taken straight to a small room next to the cabinet. There, Emperor Hongren had erected a thin silk curtain and sat inside listening to his narration. I sat taking notes, only a few steps away from the two of them, but it felt like I was standing on the edge of a story that had begun long ago. His voice was low and slow. He said that he used to be a villager on the Red River, where the Hongjiang rebellion emerged. At first, he and the villagers joined the rebels because they believed in the promise of keeping the land and sharing the rice. But then, in that army, there appeared people who took advantage of the name to rob and take personal revenge. He left, wandering around the towns, but his heart still felt heavy for his homeland. Hearing that the court intended to negotiate, he returned to Sun Nam, secretly investigated the situation, and now returned to report. What he said silenced the room. The rebel leader was beginning to suspect his subordinates, and was spreading his troops out to guard against betrayal. The people, initially enthusiastic, were now discouraged by the lack of improvement in their lives, but they were still afraid of the imperial army, and feared reprisals if they laid down their arms. "If your majesty wants to put out the fire," he said, "show them a way back to their villages without losing everything." The emperor sat behind the curtain, silent for a long time. Finally he asked, "What do you come back for? Salary? Title?" He replied immediately, without hesitation, "I just hope the road back to the village is not stained with blood, no matter whose blood it is." I looked up and met the emperor's gaze through the silk curtain. His gaze was no longer cold like during court sessions, but rather carried the wariness of someone having to decide between two bumpy paths. After the meeting, the emperor kept him in the capital, providing him with lodgings in a row of houses near the Imperial Guard barracks. I was assigned to occasionally talk to him to record what he remembered about life in Sun Nam: secret paths, hidden ferry ports, neutral families who could act as intermediaries. These pieces of information gradually formed a map not only of geography, but of the human heart. One time when it was raining, he sat on the porch, mending his old raincoat, and said, "You know, in my hometown there is a saying, rain soaks into the ground, people suffer for a long time, and when anger builds up, all it takes is a small spark to spread the fire. But maybe, if there is another rain of justice, of hope, the ground will cool down, and the fire will go out by itself." I listened, but did not respond, because I knew that was what the emperor was also considering. In the following days in the secret edicts, we see the shadow of his words: provisions on tax reduction, on guarantees of safety for the rebels if they disband, on re-examining the crimes of those who followed only for food. The emperor did not say whose intention it was. He lit a small lamp in the room, filled with the darkness of suspicion, and I wonder, perhaps that light, if bright enough, will show the way for Sun Nam to return to the court without further bloodshed. But if not, it may also go out, leaving only the shadow of someone who once returned, but no one remembers. One early winter night, when the north wind began to blow, I was copying the edict when there was a light knock on the door of the small room of the cabinet. Opening the door, I saw a familiar eunuch with a furtive face, holding a roll of paper wrapped in coarse cloth in his arms. He whispered, "Someone sent it specifically for you, telling you to read it alone." When we opened the cloth, inside was a letter written on pale yellow paper. What immediately caught our attention was no seal, no signature, just neat lines of writing, written in black ink mixed with kitchen ash, making the letters a bit gray. The tone was simple, but the words were firm, as if the writer did not need to hide what he wanted to say, he just did not want to reveal his identity. The letter begins, "If your majesty truly wants peace, please listen to the people more than the words of the mandarins." The author then tells of his days in Sun Nam, the scene of spoiled rice, dead fish filling the river, children emaciated from hunger. Interspersed are stories of tax collectors coming to every house, not sparing those who have just had a bad harvest or are seriously ill. Fire does not burn by itself, it burns because of dry straw. Dry straw is the people's hearts that have lost faith. The letter ended with straightforward proposals: immediate tax relief for the disaster area, the abolition of some unreasonable levies, and most importantly, a guarantee that those who laid down their arms would not be executed. If the people believe that laying down their spears means death, they will hold their spears to the end. But if they know that laying down their spears means life, they will go home. I read it all, and an indescribable feeling arose in my heart, both sympathy and confusion. Without any punctuation or name, this letter could not be considered an official document, but the words were too clear to ignore. I pondered for an hour, then decided to bring it to Emperor Hongren. He received me in his study, a small oil lamp illuminating his pensive face. After reading, the emperor placed the letter on the table, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the paper. He did not ask who the letter was from, but simply said, "No seal, no name." But sometimes, the truth comes to our ears through that way. He took the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in the drawer beside his desk. "I will remember what this man said," he said softly, "but I will also remember that there is sometimes only a thin veil separating truth and falsehood." In the following days, we noticed some new movements from the court. The Ministry of Finance was ordered to reinvestigate the tax records of the flood-affected areas. The Ministry of Justice reduced the punishment for crimes related to rebellion if there was no bloodshed, And most importantly, an edict was issued, publicly promising to discriminate between merit and fault, not to generalize the crimes of the entire population in the rebel areas. The unsigned letter has never been mentioned publicly, but to me it is like a small stone thrown into a still pond. Its ripples spread out. No one can see where it started, but everyone can feel the water has changed. One night, when I went out for some air, I saw the returnee leaning against the railing, looking south. The cold wind blew his faded raincoat. When he saw me, he just smiled and asked casually, "Have you ever believed that an anonymous letter could save a life?" I wanted to ask him if he knew anything about that letter, but then I stopped because in his eyes I saw the answer was already there, just waiting for someone to be perceptive enough to recognize it. And so, among the red-stamped edicts and solemn memorials, a letter without a seal still quietly existed, like a small but sharp piece in the game of power between the court and the people. As winter entered December, the Red River subsided but remained cold, its waters swirling with thin mists every morning. During those days, Emperor Hong Nam secretly summoned me and the returnee to a small room behind Kin Thien Palace. On the table was a hand-drawn map, not the kind used in court, but with smudged ink and yellowed paper from being opened and folded many times. "Tell me about these roads," the emperor said, his voice low and short. The returnee bent down, pointing to each drawing. The trails winding through the bamboo banks, the riverside paths where small boats could dock without being detected, the high dry strips of land between the swampy fields, where troops were assembled or food was hidden. He spoke of them as if he were talking about the veins hidden under the skin of his homeland. Each path had its own story, an abandoned well used as a rendezvous, an ancient banyan tree, concealing an underground wharf, a small temple in the middle of the fields, where news was hidden in the niches of statues. The emperor listened attentively, occasionally nodding or asking questions about distances and terrain. I took down every word, knowing that these were not just military records, they were a map of the people's hearts. These underground paths were originally used by villagers to avoid taxes, evade military service, or engage in clandestine trade when the imperial court banned it. When the insurgents rose up, they became the lifeblood of the movement, carrying messages, transporting grain, and hiding the wounded. And now, if the imperial court wanted to settle things peacefully, these trails could become a bridge to peace, or conversely, a stab in the back if left unchecked. The returner recounted that in Sun Nam there was a small river only about 30 paces wide, but the reed banks were so dense that large boats could not enter. At night, just by turning on the lights, small boats could carry people across without anyone noticing. There was also a dirt road through the Kajaput forest, which was fast in the dry season, but muddy in the rainy season, making pursuit almost hopeless. The emperor asked, "You know all these roads?" He nodded. "I have been there before, when I was with the rebels and when I left. Every road has eyes and ears. Whoever goes without the people's trust will never reach his destination." That statement makes us shudder, because it is not just a geographical statement, but a political truth. After that day, the emperor secretly ordered a small group of soldiers to disguise themselves as merchants and go into the villages along the river to investigate. No one in the court knew except a few people in the cabinet. I was given the entire map, locked in an iron chest, with the key divided into two halves, one half for the emperor to keep, the other for me to keep. In the days that followed, the reports were the same. The underground routes were still active, the rebels were still moving nightly, but there were some abandoned sections. Signs that the cohesion was faltering. Some of the secret forts were now only cold ash, indicating that they had been abandoned or burned to prevent exploitation. One night, the returnee came to me, carrying a small piece of paper, drawing a diagram of a new road connecting the abandoned ferry to a small hamlet beyond the control of the rebels, he said. This could be a way to bring the court's message in without being blocked. I saw the shaky handwriting from writing hastily, and knew that he had taken a great risk to discover this route. The news was received by the emperor at once, and a week later, several brief, unsigned letters reached influential men in the insurgents by that route. The content was not an order but a promise. If they laid down their arms, they would be pardoned and helped back to their villages. We do not know how far that promise will go, nor whether those underground paths will lead to peace or to deeper war. But we do understand that, on this chessboard, there are paths that no one but the people and those like the returnees can see. And the emperor is trying to use those very paths to end the game without having to swing his sword. In January, the weather in the north was dry but bitterly cold. In the Sun Nam fields, the old rice crop had long been harvested, but the new crop had not yet been sown. In the middle of that empty space, the ground cracked under the feet of the people, just like the people's hearts, dry, tired, waiting for a rain that had not yet come. From the capital, Emperor Hongren sent a small delegation to the border area under the pretext of surveying the crop situation. I was able to follow the delegation, knowing that this was actually an opportunity to observe which side the people were leaning towards. Along the way, the villages were quiet. Some houses had their gates closed, only a peek through the cracks. Some were open, but the owner's eyes were full of vigilance. We passed abandoned fields, with weeds growing knee-high, interspersed with some plowed but unsown plots. People feared that if the war broke out after the sowing, the rice would become fodder for the horses. At a riverbank, we met an old man mending a torn net. He looked at our group and slowly said, "The harvest has not yet come, but I fear that you will return first." When we asked, he smiled faintly. "That is, if the people no longer believe in this land. They will leave to find another land, even before the new harvest." That saying followed us all the way. In a small hamlet, we saw some young men repairing an old granary. They said that in case the rice arrived, there would be a place to store it, but their tone was as if they were not sure that it would happen. In a corner of the yard, some children were playing sentinels, using bamboo sticks instead of spears. We saw there both an innocent joke and a sign of a generation growing up amid war. That evening, the group stayed at a riverside inn. The innkeeper, a widow, said that for the past few months, the customers had been mostly smugglers and messengers, not real merchants. They walked quickly and spoke little, but sometimes left a few words for each other, all about the rebels and the court. She lowered her voice. Some said that if the court kept its word, they would lay down their weapons. Others said that once they had picked up their spears, they could not put them down again. The next day, the group reached an area controlled by the rebels. Here we witnessed a strange scene, a group of villagers and a group of rebels working together on a dike, reinforcing a eroded area. No one wore armor, no one held weapons, just hoes, shovels, and cracked hands. One of the group whispered, "They are still people, just wearing a different name." I recorded that scene in detail to send back to the capital, because it showed that the gap between war and peace still existed. A gap that, if skillful, the court could step into. Returning to the capital, the emperor read the report for a long time without saying anything. Finally, he just sighed. "The harvest has not yet come, and the people's hearts have not yet returned. If we do not find a way, there will come a season when no one will harvest the rice, and this land will only have weeds." From that day on, a series of new edicts were issued, encouraging people to sow spring rice by providing seeds, and exempting them from taxes, establishing a crop protection team consisting of both militia and imperial soldiers, and appointing honest officials to supervise the distribution. These orders were written like seeds sown on dry ground, hoping to germinate before the storm came. But we understand that the harvest is not just about the rice in the field, it is also about faith. And if that faith does not come in time, then all seeds, no matter how good, can be blown away in the storm. Just as the spring seeds were being sown, a terrible news blew like a cold wind from the south into the capital. From the district along the Ninh River, the horse station urgently reported. The sound of drums urging the army to fight resounded all night long. The insurgents gathered, raised a new flag, and advanced north. This news caused the entire cabinet to convene immediately. On the map, Ninh County was only a day's journey from the imperial control line. If they advanced any further, the newly sown spring fields would become a trampling ground for horses, and all previous attempts at reconciliation would be in vain. I was called into the middle of the meeting to read the recent reports from Sun Nam in it. There was a passage that clearly stated, some rebel groups separated from the Hongjiang leader, claiming new titles, acting without following the general order. At that time, the returnee was also present, standing still in the corner, his eyes as if he had predicted this would happen. Emperor Hong Nam was silent for a long time, then asked, "Is that drum sound calling the people or the enemy?" The returnee replied, "Both, your majesty. The drums are both for rallying and for threatening. But once beaten, no one will ever hear the sound of reconciliation again." The atmosphere in the room became tense. The hardliners immediately proposed sending troops from Kinback town down to intercept them before they crossed the border. The moderates asked for a week's delay, sending emissaries to find out if this was an attack or just a show. The emperor nodded slightly, then turned to me. "You and 2 others, go at once that night. Count the beats when you hear the drums, remember the colors when you see the flags. Come back and tell me who they are, how far they are going, and whether the people will follow them or not." That night, we left Thang long before the moon rose, and our horses galloped along the great dike. The northeast monsoon cut into our faces, and the sound of our hooves echoed like the underground drums of the earth. Near dawn, when we were still more than 10 miles from Ninh district, we heard the sound of the drums, deep, urgent, in each set of 3 short beats followed by 1 long beat. The returner once said that each beat of the drum had its own meaning. 3 short and 1 long was the signal to advance. From the bamboo grove by the roadside we saw them, about 300 people. Brown shirts mixed with some old armor, new flags with the image of a flaming kite. They did not move quickly, but their ranks were quite regular. Along the way, some of the village boys dropped their hoes and ran after them. Others stood and watched, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. We followed them until they stopped on a high ground by the river. The campfires blazed, the drums stopped. Instead, the horns sounded long and drawn out like a call through the mist. A small group broke off, rowing across to the other side, toward the imperial grounds. We turned our horses and returned to Thang long before dark. When I finished reporting, the emperor did not say anything right away, but just sat there, watching the candle sway in the wind. Finally, he said, "The drum beat from the south has crossed the newly sown rice fields. If we do not stop it, it will trample the harvest." The very next day an order was given. Troops from Kinback town were to advance, but they were to bring with them the box containing the letter of reconciliation. The emperor wanted, before the swords clashed, to have one last chance for the voice to replace the drumbeat. We understand that the battle, if it happens, will not only take place on the riverbank, but also in the heart of each person. Whether to hold the flag or drop the spear, listen to the drum or listen to the words, and that will decide whether this year's harvest will come or not. That morning the fog had not yet cleared when the army from Kinback town advanced down following the Great Dyke. On the canvas-covered carriage in the middle of the formation, in addition to the weapon box, there was another box, smaller but with an elaborately carved bronze lock. Inside was the imperial edict of Emperor Hongnam written on yellow paper, stamped with a vermilion seal, with words carefully considered word by word. That edict, if read at the right time and place, could save a crop and hundreds of lives. But if read at the wrong time, it would be buried under the sound of drums and spears. We went with a group, with the task of ensuring that the imperial letter reached the head of the new rebel army. The meeting place chosen was a wide riverbank, where the receding water revealed a long strip of sand like a silk strip, dividing the two sides by only a small creek. On one side were the imperial army, on the other were the rebel army with the flaming kite flag. Both sides stopped, keeping a distance of about 100 paces. The wind from the river blew strongly, making the flags flutter and making it difficult to hear people's voices. To bridge that distance, a temporary bamboo bridge was built right in the middle of the sandbank. On the bridge, I and the Ministry of Personnel official carried the imperial edict box, walking slowly towards the middle, where the leader of the insurgent army was waiting. He wore an indigo shirt, a red turban, and his eyes were sharp as knives but not ferocious. When we stopped, the Ministry of Personnel official opened the chest, took out the imperial edict, and began to read. His voice was loud, each word clear. "I understand that the people are hungry and suffering because of natural disasters and corrupt officials. I order reduction in spring taxes, abolition of corvée duties for disaster areas, and no punishment for those who lay down their arms. Those who want to return to their villages will be able to return. Those who want to keep their fields will be able to keep them." The reading stopped, leaving only the sound of wind and waves. The rebel leader was silent for a long time, then chuckled softly. "Your Majesty knows how to speak sweet words, but sweet words cannot feed a hungry stomach," the officer replied. "Therefore, the new edict has this added clause. The granary in Nintown will be opened, distributing rice to the people of Sannam regardless of which side they are on." The leader frowned slightly at that statement. He looked across the river to where a group of villagers stood watching from afar, their eyes filled with anticipation. Perhaps he understood that if he accepted the rice, he would lose the greatest reason to maintain the uprising. But if he refused, he would lose the people's hearts right before his eyes. After a moment of silence, he said, "I need 3 days to discuss with my people. During those 3 days, the imperial army cannot advance one step further." The official nodded but emphasized, 3 days, no more, because spring does not wait. We returned to this shore. The letter remained in the chest, for the chief refused to receive it by hand. He said that to accept it would be considered a surrender, but the contents had reached him, and through other ears, would reach every house in the village. That night, the imperial camp by the river was quieter than usual. I lay in my tent, listening to the sound of the water lapping at the banks and thinking about the newly sown rice. 3 days was too short to change people's hearts, but long enough for the fire to die out, or flare up again. On the first day, the morning mist covered the riverbank. The imperial army camped on one side, the rebel army camped on the other, separated only by a small creek but seemingly miles apart. The drums stopped, replaced by the crowing of roosters and the oars of a few fishing boats drifting slowly downstream. The emperor's orders were clear: no provocation, no advance, keep your distance. We walked along the riverbank and saw that the insurgents were as busy as on this side. They were lighting fires, drying clothes, and mending nets. A few young people stood on the bank, looking toward the imperial camp, not with hostility, but as if they were examining it. This feeling was very strange, as if both sides were waiting for a festival, not a battle. On the second day, a group of villagers brought baskets of rice and vegetables from the neutral zone to the riverbank. They divided them equally between the two sides, without saying much. When I asked, an old woman just smiled. "We are all villagers. Whether we fight or make peace, we still have to eat." This news spread quickly throughout the camp, and I saw a few imperial soldiers start chatting with the rebels across the riverbank, exchanging trivialities about the weather and the crops. That afternoon, the returnee accompanied me to a high mound, with a clear view of both banks. He pointed to a few temporary tents set up by the insurgents. "That's where the tired will return. If there are no drums tonight, it means they are thinking." Sure enough, There were no drums that night, only the sounds of insects and running water. On the third day, the sun was shining. In the morning, a few groups of rebels walked along the riverbank, waving from afar. Some even threw over a few fish they had just caught, as if to say, "We are still human." The atmosphere suddenly lightened, but at that moment, news from the scouts arrived. A small group of rebels had split off during the night, heading south. It was unclear whether they were leaving or seeking reinforcements. That same afternoon, the leader of the insurgents appeared on the other side of the river, where the bamboo bridge had been temporarily built. He carried no weapons, only an indigo shirt and a red scarf, and signaled that he wanted to talk. The Ministry of Personnel official and I brought the box containing the imperial edict to the middle of the bridge. He did not receive the letter, but said, "Over the past 3 days, I have seen that you have kept your word. The villagers have accepted the rice, and no one has been arrested. But there are still some in the rebel army who do not believe. If we lower the flag now, they will think that we have betrayed our brothers. We need some more time." The officer replied, his voice calm but resolute. "Time is something we do not have much of. Spring is coming, and the harvest will not wait." He was silent, his eyes looking down at the stream flowing between the two banks. Finally, he said, "Give me 7 more days. If within those 7 days, there is no bloodshed, I will lower the flag." Both sides left the bridge, without shaking hands, but without turning their backs immediately. When we returned to camp, the emperor was informed. He only said one sentence: 7 days. Is like waiting for rain to dry out the fields. It could save the rice crop, or just let the grass grow more. That night, I could not sleep. The sound of the water lapping against the shore sounded like a countdown clock. And I knew that the coming days would decide not only the fate of a group of soldiers, but also the fragile trust that was sprouting between the two banks of the river. On the first day of the new 7 days, the river was calm. Both banks were as still as if holding their breath. The imperial soldiers were ordered to practice but did not approach the creek. On the other side, the rebels also erected bamboo fences, as a reminder that this boundary could not be erased. Fishermen still rowed their boats back and forth, carrying fragmentary news where buffaloes were lost, where harvests were early, but there was absolutely no talk of war or peace. On the second day, a light drizzle fell, making everything blurry. From the royal camp, I saw a few figures on the other side of the river wearing conical hats, walking back and forth as if on guard. At noon, the returnee whispered to me, "There is a group of rebels discussing retreating to their hometowns. They do not want to follow the flag anymore." But he also reminded that the stubborn ones still remained, and just one false rumor would bring swords and spears back to the drawing board. On the third day, something strange happened. A boy of about 10 years old, the son of a villager in the neutral zone, ran into the imperial camp with a bundle of dong leaves. Inside were a few potatoes and a piece of paper scribbled, "We don't want to fight, but we are afraid." The note was unsigned, but it was enough to stir up the camp. The emperor, when informed, simply said, "Keep quiet. Don't turn their fear into a weapon." On the fourth day, the sky was clear. A group of imperial soldiers and rebels happened to meet at a narrow stretch of river where fishermen gathered. At first, there were only wary glances, then a few questions about fish and shrimp, the water season. No one mentioned the war, but we could clearly see that the distance between the two banks was narrowing, not by bamboo bridges, but by everyday conversations. On the fifth day, word came from the scouts that the rebel group that had broken away earlier had returned, but without any more men or weapons. This relieved the imperial camp. But the returnee reminded them with no more aid, they will have to choose either peace or a last desperate attempt. On the sixth day, singing could be heard from the other side of the river. It was not the sound of drums urging the troops on, but the voices of young girls pounding rice. The familiar folk melody wafted across the river, causing many imperial soldiers to raise their heads to listen. In that moment, the battle lines faded away, leaving only the singing that reminded them of the days when the village had not yet been divided. The seventh day, the last day, was warm and sunny, with a light breeze. In the morning, both banks were quieter than usual, as if waiting for something. At noon, a red flag was lowered on the other bank. There were no drums, no horns, just a few men slowly rolling up the flag and putting it away in a box. That afternoon, the leader of the insurgents stepped out onto the bamboo bridge, this time without his entourage. He looked at the Ministry of Personnel official, then looked at me and said softly, "We will disperse, but keep your word to the people. If one person is unjustly killed, this flag will fly again." The official nodded, took out the imperial edict from the box and handed it to him. For the first time, he accepted it without avoiding it. As the sun sets, the riverbanks become deserted. Only the sound of water lapping at the banks remains, as if erasing the traces of 7 days of tension. We know this is not permanent peace, but a bloodless season, and perhaps the ground for the next harvest. When the sound of war drums faded into the past, Sun Nam began to hear the familiar sounds of the season again, the rustling of rice, the sound of plowing the soil, the calls of each other on the fields. In the early days, the villagers were still hesitant, working slowly as if afraid that a shout would force them to drop their hoes and pick up their spears. But then, rows of green rice seedlings gradually covered the fields that had been abandoned for several seasons. Emperor Hong Ren ordered the Ministry of Finance to provide more rice seeds and plowing oxen to the areas hit hard by the war. Rice distribution stations in Nintown remained open, but now there were more people lining up, believing that coming to collect the rice would not mean having their names recorded for future arrest. Boats loaded with rice seedlings sailed along the Red River, docking at each village, and children cheered at the sight of the new green. We were sent to the villages to supervise the distribution of seeds, and at the same time to observe whether the people were really at peace. In Dinthuang village we saw a scene that would have been hard to believe a few months ago. A group of former rebels, now putting away their red scarves and working with the villagers to rebuild the dike, laughing and talking as if they had never been on opposing sides. During a lunch break, an old farmer sitting under a banyan tree told me, "This land only needs peace and quiet to become as good as before. The fields that were abandoned for 2 crops are now green, thanks to heaven, and also thanks to people not killing each other anymore." His voice was not resentful, just like repeating a common sense that everyone understood. At another riverbank, I met the returnee helping to unload rice seedlings onto the boat. He was no longer wearing his old raincoat but was wearing the brown clothes of a farmer. Seeing me, he smiled. "Do you see? No drums, no flags, only the sound of frogs calling for rain." I recognized in his eyes a mixture of relief and worry, as if he knew that this seed of peace would need many more seasons to take firm root. However, not everything went smoothly. In some areas, there were still tyrants who took advantage of the people, as busy planting to seize land and force them to sell rice seeds at low prices. The news was reported to the capital, and the emperor immediately sent an honest official to deal with the troublemakers and severely punish them. He understood that a successful harvest not only needed favorable weather, but also needed justice to protect it. A few months later, when the rice began to turn golden yellow, I returned to Sun Nam again. The smell of ripe rice spread throughout the fields, making people forget the smell of gunpowder that had lingered here. The shiny sickles swept through each rice flower. The cheerful laughter followed one another. On the banks, children ran to pick up the fallen rice, singing folk songs that no one dared to sing last season. On the first harvest day, the former leader of the fire kite flag, now just a farmer, stood in the middle of his field, planting a bundle of rice on the dike. It was not a flag, nor a sign of rebellion, just a promise to sow more and harvest more next season. I stood from afar watching that scene and thought, the return of the harvest is not only the return of rice grains, but also the return of faith in people's hearts. Although the future is unknown, at least at this moment, the 2 banks of the river have shared a golden season. At the end of the harvest, when the sheaves of rice were stacked in golden piles across the drying yard, a strange wind from the north began to blow. The wind was not strong, but it carried an unusual chill, signaling that winter had come earlier than usual. For the peasants, the arrival of the monsoon was a matter of nature. But for the court, the change in wind direction often signaled other changes as well: political, popular, and power. News from Kinback reported, some old army groups of the court, previously stationed at the border, now began to have discord. They complained about lack of food, slow rewards, and some people had returned home without permission. Emperor Hong Nam heard the news and just nodded slightly. "The new wind blows. The new flag must be adjusted." I was called into the inner palace to discuss with the returnee how to handle the situation. He said, "Your Majesty, peace has just taken root in Sun Nam. If the imperial army at the border is not at peace, and news of this gets here, the seeds will be blown away by the wind." The emperor pondered. "Where do you think this wind comes from?" "From hungry bellies and discontented hearts, Your Majesty." The very next day, a convoy carrying food and silver rewards was urgently sent to Kinback, along with an imperial edict clearly reminding him of his merits in defending the border. But the emperor also knew that putting out the fire at the border was only part of the problem. The more worrying thing was the direction of the wind in the hearts of the people, which was more unpredictable than the weather. In Sun Nam, we noticed new conversations starting to buzz in the tea shops in Riverside. Some said that the court was only concerned with the soldiers at the border, forgetting about the people in the fields. Others said that if the rebellion in the north broke out, Sun Nam would be caught up in a new vortex. The returnee quietly inquired and reported back. A few ruffians who had once joined the insurgents were gathering. They did not carry flags or beat drums, but took advantage of the lack of work in the winter to lure young people out of the village. They told the people that when the wind changes, the boat must turn, and promised to get a share if they sided with the new side. This news made us understand that the wind was not only blowing from the north, but had already crept into every alley. If we did not stop it in time, its coldness would cause the next crop to shrink like rice leaves facing frost. We sent an urgent letter to the capital. The emperor responded with a simple order: peace the hearts of the people before you can pacify the land. And to do that, we and the returnee began new journeys. To each village, each market, telling the story of the 7 bloodless days and the promise kept. We reminded them that the monsoon would eventually change, but the land would remain, and the rice would only grow if it was planted in peace. There were evenings when we could hear the north wind whistling through the bamboo groves, but inside the houses, the fire was blazing and laughter drowned out the wind. At that time, we understood that keeping the wind from blowing away the crops was like keeping the oil lamp from going out at night. It required both a protective hand and faith in the coming dawn. Banyan used to be the busiest place in the lower reaches of the Ninh River, where boats from all the villages came to transport rice, dried fish, and ceramics to the capital. But that winter, when the north wind still blew through the bamboo banks, the wharf was covered with an unusually gloomy atmosphere. During the day, there were still the sounds of oars and merchants bargaining, but at night, people told stories about dark shadows appearing on the wharf, then disappearing as if they had never been there. At first, everyone thought it was a child scare. But then, 3 consecutive rice boats from Sun Nam to the capital disappeared while anchored at this wharf. No bloodshed, no screams, only broken anchor ropes and strange footprints on the sandbank. When the news reached the emperor, he immediately called me into the palace. "You go down there now. If the grain is lost, the people will starve next season. Don't let the seeds disappear before they are sown." We set off with the Returnee that same night. When we reached Ninh Wharf, the dim moonlight shone down on the muddy river. The owner of the wharf, an old man, said that the dark figures often appeared at the third watch, in groups of 4 or 5, without saying a word, just working as they had long practiced, he said. They know where the boat is weakly anchored, and which house has a guard who is dozing off. The first night, the Returnee and I hid in the barn, waiting. Near midnight, the fog was as thick as smoke, and the sound of water lapping softly against the side of the boat. Then, from the darkness, 5 black figures emerged, moving so lightly that the sand did not creak underfoot. They were in no hurry, but each movement was precise. 1 cut the anchor rope, 2 searched the boat's hold, 1 watched the shore, and the last one signaled to retreat. The Returnee whispered, "These are not ordinary thieves, they are trained." I understood what he meant. This was the sign of an organization, possibly a remnant of the rebel army or a group of exiles from the north. As they withdrew, we signaled to follow. They followed the riverside path, through a cajaput forest, and disappeared into an abandoned warehouse. Through the crack in the door, we saw that the inside was filled with sacks of rice, too many to feed just one group. We retreated silently, leaving no trace. The next morning, I secretly informed the Sun Nam governor. A plan was drawn up. The fake rice boat would anchor at the wharf. The soldiers would disguise themselves as porters. And when the shadow appeared, the encirclement would be closed. The next night, everything went as predicted. As the shadow cut the anchor rope, the nets fell from all sides. Shoutouts rang out, but not a single one surrendered. They desperately tried to break out of the encirclement, but only to escape into the forest. The rest were captured alive. By torchlight, we realized they were all young men from the border region, with tattoos of flaming kites on their shoulders. Remnants of the old insurgents. They said that they did not sell the stolen rice, but stored it in case the wind changes direction. That statement was like a thorn reminding us that peace was still fragile. The rice was returned to the boat owner, but Ninh Wharf kept extra guards all winter. When we left that place, the river still rolled under the moonlight, as if hiding many untold stories. After the arrest of the Black Shadow at Banyan, the Sun Nam area was temporarily peaceful, but the Returnee reminded us that this peace was like the surface of a winter lake.com above, but with an unpredictable current below. Indeed, not long after, a strange news reached our ears. In Din Throng village, every night of the 1st and 15th of the lunar month, a few people gathered under the ancient banyan tree in the communal house yard, whispering stories that no one knew. The old man who kept the temple said, they didn't cause any trouble or burn anything, but their eyes looked strange, as if they were remembering something and as if they were waiting for an appointment. When we asked, he just sighed. This banyan tree used to be where the insurgents gathered before going down to the riverbank. We decided to go with the Returnee on the full moon night. The moon was bright. The shadows of the banyan trees were long, partially covering the communal house yard. About 10 men, mostly young men, stood in a circle, talking in low voices. They did not notice us hiding in the darkness. The content of the conversation was fragmentary. When the rice is ripe, the wind changes, the person will return. The Returnee whispered in my ear. They didn't say their names, but this is how the old rebels gave out code words. Maybe they were waiting for a leader to return. We watched for a few more nights. Each time, the number of people present was different, but always the same time and place. Strangely, beside them sometimes appeared a woman in her 30s, wearing a brown shirt and a crow's-beak scarf, standing a few steps away from the circle. She did not join in the conversation, just listened quietly, then left before the meeting ended. One evening, when the crowd had just dispersed, I decided to follow the woman. She walked through a few small alleys and arrived at a thatched house on the edge of the village. Inside, I saw an old sword hanging on the wall, and below was a simple altar with an incense burner. Looking closely, I realized that it was the sword that had belonged to a rebel general who had been executed 2 years earlier. The next day, I asked some villagers in secret. They said she was the general's wife, and since her husband's death, she had lived alone and had not remarried. The villagers loved her but were also wary, because they knew she had been with the insurgents. I reported this news to the capital. The emperor wrote back only one line: "Keep your distance but don't lose sight of me." Sometimes old roots grow back from the most unexpected places. From there, we continued to observe the banyan tree. Spring had come, and the foliage was green, covering the entire gathering. The number of people seemed to have increased, but no one seemed to be in a hurry. Their conversation was still vague, as if everyone was waiting for a signal that no one dared to give. The returner tells us they are the ones standing in the middle, not yet completely letting go, nor yet picking up their weapons. A promise under the banyan tree could be the thread that connects them, or cuts them off completely, and we know that the string, when stretched, can break at any moment, especially when the political winds begin to change direction again. The night of the 8th of March was pitch black. The moon was completely swallowed by thick clouds, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the bamboo groves and the damp smell of the earth after the afternoon rain. I was staying at Dinh Thuong village communal house, pretending to be the caretaker of the offerings, so that I could conveniently observe the ancient banyan tree. The returnee hid in the shadow of the roof, his eyes never leaving the large yard in front of the communal house. Near the third watch, from afar, an owl called out 3 times, intermittently. I was startled. Owls were a common occurrence in this area, but 3 consecutive calls was a signal in the old insurgents' secret intelligence system. Just a few minutes later, figures appeared from the dark alleys, quietly approaching the banyan tree. There weren't many of them, only about 8, but everyone's eyes were bright in the dark, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. In the middle of the circle, a strange man stepped out. He wore a black tunic, a scarf wrapped around his head, and his voice was small but clear. "The wind has turned. He will return before the harvest." That sentence made the faces around him light up with an indescribable light, both hopeful and excited. I realized this was the most dangerous thing. A vague promise, but strong enough to make people forget the current peace. The man continued, "We will not rush. Just keep the fire burning. When the signal comes, the flags will fly again. The drums will beat again. At that time, the traitors will be wiped out." The returnee glanced at me, his eyes as if to remind me, this is a fire. If left to burn, it will engulf the entire green rice field. The meeting ended as quickly as it had begun. Everyone went their separate ways, without another word. The returnee and I followed the strange man. He left the village and followed the dirt road along the river. Suddenly, a small boat was waiting from the reed bank. He stepped onto it, gently rowed his oars, and the boat disappeared into the night. Unable to catch up, we returned to the pavilion. In my heart, I knew that tonight's signal was not an impromptu event. There was a hand farther away, stronger, pulling the strings that connected these people. The next morning, I called the old man from the temple and some elders in the village to ask him about it. They all said they did not know who the man was. They only saw him come here exactly 2 days ago and asked to stay at a tea shop near the market. When I went back to look for him, he had disappeared, leaving behind a Dong Zhuang silver coin with a northern seal, something that was rarely seen here. I reported this news to the capital. After hearing it, the emperor only said, "The wind from the north brings more than cold. It also brings fire." From that day on, the banyan tree still stood still, its leaves swaying in the wind, but we knew that beneath its old roots there was an underground stream flowing, and if we did not stop it in time, it would overflow before the next harvest. After that night of signal, the returnee and I decided to split up and follow Dinh Thuong closely. I stayed in the village, while he disguised himself as a ceramic merchant and went to the local markets to find out how much fire the strange man had planted. Day after day, the ancient banyan tree remained peaceful with the chirping of sparrows in the morning and the shade for children at noon. But we knew that beneath that layer of tranquility, an underground current was spreading. A few young men who had once joined the old army began to come and go more often, under the pretext of helping with the communal house, sweeping the yard, and repairing the roof tiles. In their conversations with the villagers, we heard words like justice, taking back the land, people returning. One evening, while sitting drinking water at a shop by the river, I heard 2 boatmen whispering. They said if there is not enough rice next season, the flag will fly again. But this year the rice is good. How can there be a shortage? Short or not, as long as someone creates the shortage. That last sentence makes me shudder. The hidden thread is not just an empty promise. It is trying to dig into the people's source of life. Rice grains. The returnee reported some disturbing news. At Dong Pho Market, someone had secretly bought rice at a high price, but had not resold it. The amount of rice that had disappeared was not enough to cause immediate famine, but if it continued, there would be a shortage of seeds next season. Strangely, when investigating the source of the money, he discovered silver coins bearing the northern mark identical to the ones we saw after the signal incident. I immediately sent people to track these rice-carrying boats. Finally, they stopped at an abandoned warehouse on the banks of the Jia River, the former gathering place of the old rebels. That night, I and a group of soldiers quietly surrounded it. In the warehouse, besides rice, there were also a few wooden chests containing red cloth, hand drums, and some rust-free swords. Without anyone saying anything, I understood that this was preparation for a real return, but the problem was, arresting all the warehouse guards would only be like cutting off the top, while the roots would still be deeply rooted in the village. The emperor had once said, "Keep the people's hearts at peace before keeping the land at peace." If we were too harsh, the people would believe the stranger's words that the court was afraid. The returnee and I discussed and finally chose to quietly take back the rice and distribute it to the people that night. No flags were hung, no names were announced, only a small piece of paper was left on the rice bag. Your seeds should be in your hands. The next morning, the whole village was in an uproar. No one knew who had done it, but I noticed that the young men who frequented the banyan tree began to avoid my eyes. An old woman said, if someone really cared about the people, they would feed them, not take them away. That remark was like a hoe cutting into the underground stream, slowing it down, at least in the eyes of the common people. But we know that the vein is not dry yet. It is just looking for another path, deeper, more hidden, waiting for a strong enough wind to blow everything up to the ground. And then, not only the banyan tree, but the whole field will shake. The news came one afternoon in early summer, when the rice fields had just begun to bear ears. He has returned. The rumor spread like fire through dry straw, from the riverbank to the tea shop, from the village gate to the district market. No one knew who he was, only that he had been a general of the old insurgent army, had escaped death during the siege years ago, and had now returned from the north. At the Dinthrong banyan tree, the number of people gathered doubled. They whispered about a secret meeting, saying that he would appear on the next full moon night. At the riverbank where the confrontation between the royal court and the insurgents had taken place, I received this news from the returnee. His eyes were both serious and worried. If he is who they say he is, the whole undercurrent will erupt in waves. And this time the waves will wash away more than a riverbank. We immediately reported to the capital. After hearing this, the emperor only said, "The wind has changed. If the flag flies again, don't let it stand long." On the full moon night, the returnee and I hid among the reeds on the riverbank. The moonlight poured down onto the water, making the whole bank as bright as day. Groups of people from the villages came, silent, their eyes fixed on the empty space in the middle of the bank. Then he appeared, a tall man, wearing an old indigo shirt, with a long scar on his forehead, his eyes as sharp as ever. He didn't say much, just stepped onto the mound in the middle of the field, and gestured with his hand. The sound of hand drums slowly sounded, each beat like a knock on the hearts of those present. He began to talk about the days not to be forgotten, the famines, the heavy taxes, the needless deaths. He did not call for revolt, but his words made the air thick. Then he opened a sack, pulled out an old red flag, and touched it as if it were the flesh of a loved one. This flag has never been burned, it only sleeps, and when the wind is right, it will fly. The drums beat louder, and a few people in the crowd stepped forward, kneeling and touching the flag. We saw faces that were both scared and fascinated. This was the moment when the underground found its way out. The returnee said softly, "If we let him go, we will lose this whole area before harvest." I gave the signal to retreat. We could not catch him in the crowd, with all eyes on him. But the next morning I sent men after him. He did not remain at the riverbank, but disappeared into the western hills. A few days later, news came. In 3 other villages, similar words were heard, and the red flag was seen raised in the moonlight. The emperor, upon receiving the report, no longer kept his voice calm. If this wind is not stopped, it will become a storm, and the storm will not only sweep away the rice but also the throne. From then on, our mission changed. It was no longer just about guarding the banyan tree or protecting the riverbank, but about hunting for a person, the returnee, before the flag actually flew across the plains. We began our hunt with the faintest traces. The returner never sleeps 2 nights in the same place. He moves like water through cracks in the rocks. The young men who once bowed their heads to touch the red flag now become his eyes and ears, ready to mislead or cover his footprints. The returnee and I decided to part ways. He followed the route of the market and the river where night boats could transport a person far away in the blink of an eye. I followed the villages where the flags had been seen, to find out who was preparing for the gathering, because if we found this link, we would know his next route. In Bai Tri village, an old wine seller revealed something important. He said that before every full moon night, a man would come and buy 2 large jars of wine, paying with strange silver engraved with the northern mark. The man never spoke, just placed the money and took the wine to the edge of the forest. The returnee and I set up an ambush at the edge of the forest the following night. When he appeared, we followed him in silence. He went deep into the forest, through a narrow ravine, to a makeshift wooden hut. Inside, the returnee was sitting. A map of the plains spread out on the table in front of him. We eavesdropped. He was pointing to points on the map, talking about the blood vessels connecting the villages, river ports, granaries, district markets, he said. When blood flows once, the heart will beat strongly. We don't need to fight, just make them believe that the court is weak. The men in the hut nodded, their eyes shining. I knew this was no dreamer, but a man with a plan, and every point on the map was a stab in the stability I had maintained all these years. As they left the hut, I gave the signal to surround them, but at that moment, an owl hooted from the top of the hill, a warning signal. Immediately the group scattered like shot birds, disappearing into the woods. The returnee and I chased after the returnee, but he moved faster and knew the terrain better than we did. When we reached the riverbank, he jumped onto a small raft that was waiting for him and drifted away in the darkness. The hunt was a failure, but we did not return empty-handed. The map was left in the hut incomplete, but enough to show where he would be in the coming moon. The emperor, upon receiving the map, said only one sentence: "It is no longer wind. It is a storm gathering clouds." From now on, the hunt would not be about following his footprints, but about staying one step ahead of him, blocking every port, every warehouse, every village, before he arrived. And we knew that hunting in the dark meant accepting that sometimes, we, too, would be swallowed by the darkness. That rainy season, clouds poured down from the north, stretching across the sky like giant gray sheets. The wind carried cold moisture seeping into every rice field, every thatched roof. The chases in the dark took us past countless riverbanks, banyan trees, and even dirt roads whose footprints were eventually erased by the rain. The returnee was not arrested. He disappeared as if he had never existed, leaving behind only half-true, half-full stories, creeping into tea shops, markets, and even the dreams of young people. The red flag did not fly, but it was not burned either. It was just silent, rolled up somewhere, waiting for another windy season. Emperor Hong Ren, upon hearing the last news I reported, only nodded slightly. Keeping this land peaceful is not winning, it is just not losing. But sometimes, not losing is enough. We returned to Sun Nam on a sunny afternoon. In the fields, the rice had turned yellow, the wind rustled like the earth clapping for the sewer. Under the banyan tree of Din Thuong children played, not knowing that this was once a place where adults whispered about the change of dynasty. Ben Nin was bustling with the sound of rowing, bargaining, and the clear laughter of fishermen. The returnee stood next to me, looked at me for a while and said, "The wind will change, but as long as one knows how to put down deep roots, the tree will stand." We understand that every storm begins with a seemingly harmless gust of wind, and our task, that of anyone who wants to keep the country peaceful, is not only to quell the storm but also to listen to the wind as it gently shakes the rice stalks. This story ends not with a resounding victory or a glorious peace, but with a full harvest. In the world of the underworld, that may be the greatest reward of all. But those who have listened to the wind know that it never disappears, it only changes direction. In a land farther away, beyond the misty mountains, some say they have seen a man in an indigo robe, with a long scar on his forehead, sitting by the fire telling stories of lost rice crops. People dare not call him by name but only whisper the returnee is still on the move, and somewhere, the red flag is still rolled up tightly, waiting for a hand to open it. At that time, this story will no longer be a memory, but will become the first page of a new history book, where wind and storm will once again compete to occupy the sky of the plain.